over-the-hill old farts like me, we're producing code again because of AI. I thought those days were, for me, over 20 years ago. Our CEO, Satya Nadella, is generating code every day. OpenAI, for their part, felt that they were seeing the future. And in fact, they went public with, hey, we think something very important is happening here. It could really change the world, but it also carries risks. And so for that reason, we are not going to publish the model weights. They hid the model weights. And in the research community, I remember that got ridiculed. No one took them seriously. At Microsoft, we took this very seriously. And in fact, started the process of deciding to make our first major investment in OpenAI. In 2019, if you said the word AI, you didn't think of some unknown little startup called OpenAI, and you didn't think of big, boring Microsoft. So no one kind of took us that seriously. And that played out again with GPT-3. The applications we're developing today, they're valuable, but they are the moral equivalent of tone generators and AM transistor radios. And the true impact of AI in the future, we can't even imagine. The two patterns that I find very interesting are:
welcome back to Lifers. I have a very special guest with me today. We're actually in the same place. We're at Lake Nona, the Impact Forum in Orlando, Florida, escaping the cold this week. This is Peter Lee. He's the president at Microsoft Research. And at a time when all we can talk about is the impact of AI, Peter was one of the few people who has been literally in the room from the early days. So I am so excited to chat with him about the evolution of AI, what it was like to be sitting there in 2019 when nobody really cared, and to know that this was coming, and then everything that he thinks is going to happen with the healthcare, science, medical industries and how they'll change because of this technology. So let's start at the beginning. Peter, you have been involved in Microsoft for such a long time, previously DARPA. You've been sitting at the cutting edge basically your whole career. So my earliest memories of some of this AI stuff was really back in the IBM Watson days, where we had a computer being successful and winning at chess and Jeopardy, and everybody said, it's so amazing. And then it just really didn't achieve the promise. And that may have been where some of that early skepticism came from. But maybe walk us through kind of your own vantage as somebody seeing this technology up close and personal, and when it felt really real to you.
Wow. Yeah. First off, Chrissy, it's really great to be here, at Lake Nona. And I don't know if your listeners need to know this, but we just spent about an hour and a half in a fun conversation. It is too bad that we didn't record that. Also, I owe you this because you were, of course, on a podcast series at Microsoft Research that I was recording, and you were really great with that. And so very, very happy, thrilled to not just return the favor, but have the honor of being on with you. I started off, I was a professor at Carnegie Mellon University for 24 years and head of computer science at the end there. And of course, Carnegie Mellon was a real hotbed for academic research in AI. And the first time I saw a deep neural net was way back in the late 80s and early 90s. Jeff Hinton, was at Carnegie Mellon as professor, Takeo Kanade, Dean Parmelau. In fact, they used a layered neural net to make a self-driving van that actually could track the road. And they drove that van on freeways, hands-free, from Pittsburgh to San Diego. So, in that sense, it has been a long road, but it left me maybe a bit jaded about the whole thing. I thought it was not going to go anywhere. It would never get over the hump of being something really practical for a lot of people.
Explain a neural net just for people who are less technical.
Right. So if you think about how to make a computer act intelligently, whatever that means. One way that you might think about doing it is, as human beings, we have certain structures in our head. You might say, well, we should try to see if we can make an algorithm that can see the edge of a road. We should have an algorithm that knows that if we're too close to one edge, that it should torque the steering wheel in some direction and so on. And you break it down into some pieces like that. And so one approach to the AI is you then try to write computer codes that encode that human level understanding of what's going on. A completely different approach is forget about all of that. And instead, taking inspiration from what we know about how the brain is structured, can we have a set of what are now called weights, model weights? They're just numbers that are networked together. Just think of a big pile of numbers in some sort of network topology. And in that network topology, can we set up the weights so that as we add up the weights going up from the bottom of the network to the top of the network, to come up with a conclusion that, well, if the bottom weights represent the scene of a roadway, can the highest number weight that comes out of the top of the network tell a machine what to do, turn the steering wheel in a certain direction? And so there, you're not thinking about this in human terms. You're just thinking about this as pure pile of numbers, pure math. And, intuitively, that idea is encoded in what we now call an artificial neural net. And what's been happening in AI recently is entirely based on that. And what's cool is that it sort of frees us from, having to write detailed recipes about how to act intelligently. You don't have to program. In fact, you don't program these neural nets. You train these neural nets. But, back in the 80s, early 90s, it just seemed too hard. They're too primitive. They were theoretically interesting, but too hard. So then you zoom all the way forward. I go from Carnegie Mellon to DARPA, and then from DARPA in 2010, I go to Microsoft Research. And one of the first projects I saw was in the speech research group. They had spent actually the summer hosting Jeff Hinton and some of his students and postdocs. And Jeff had suggested to the group at Microsoft Research, hey, have you thought about using neural nets to do speech recognition, to have a computer listen to a human being speak and then figure out what they said? And, they said no. And so they tried. In the middle of that project is when I joined Microsoft Research. And when I looked at that project, I thought, wow, this is really stupid. I really thought it was ridiculous. And I actually felt like, God, people were, and Jeff Hinton himself was thinking about this stuff way, way back in the late 80s, and he's still stuck on this. I actually felt sort of sad about the whole thing. And then, like 2 months later, the results came out with like spectacularly better speech recognition. So if you're using ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, Gemini today, and you've spoken to your AI chatbot, you kind of take it for granted that, of course, it works perfectly. But, in 2010, it absolutely wasn't the case. But now this first demonstration that, oh my God, the neural net does such a better job, was just stunning. One person who's hanging out in Microsoft Research at the time is Andrew Ng from Stanford University.
He's the guy that founded Coursera. Okay. Yep.
And so he left Microsoft Research after that because he was spending a few weeks with us. And he went to spend some time with Jeff Dean at Google.
Yep.
And had the question, I wonder if this also works for computer vision. And so he and Jeff Dean and a team at Google explored that. And that resulted in the famous kitten video detector, a neural net that could look at YouTube videos and tell you, is there a kitten in this video or not?
And now that's like so easy.
I know, it's so easy now. Yeah. And so this all happened in 2010, 2011. And for me, those were the first times when I thought, wow, neural nets, or so-called deep neural nets, they have arrived. They are going to become a really, really important thing. And in fact, all the tech companies, not just Microsoft and Google, but all the tech companies very quickly transitioned their speech and computer vision systems to neural nets, like in lightning speed. And then the next moment for me was Google Research published this now famous paper called Attention is All You Need in 2017. And it explained in a certain type of neural net that there's a mechanism, which is now called the attention mechanism, that is particularly good and very general purpose in helping to understand higher level structure, say, not only recognizing the words that someone speaks, but what they mean. And again, it was fairly theoretical. I remember seeing the paper and being impressed, but didn't think it was that consequential. But then in 2018, just 1 year later, at the Allen Institute for AI in Seattle, they used that idea to make a system called Elmo. And Elmo had 93 million parameters, 93 million artificial neurons, which at that time felt astronomically large. Today, freshmen in college make 93 million, parameter neural nets, after lunch. But at that time, it was this big, big deal. And what Elmo was able to do in understanding language was, I felt, spectacular. And it was, for me, the first hint that if you make these neural nets bigger, they will keep getting better and better.
So let's jump from here to GPT, because I know that by 2019, we're starting to see the beginnings of Sam Altman, OpenAI. You start to hear it in the ether. But you've told me in the past that nobody really believed it back then. And I remember it. I lived it. And it wasn't in the public dialogue. So how did that feel for you to be seeing it, collecting all these pieces of information over the prior several decades where you thought something is happening, but the world didn't get it, didn't see it yet?
Yeah, I think, OpenAI pivoted to focusing on these neural transformers with an attention mechanism. Ilya Sutskever, was one of the people who really, I think, had an early understanding of the potential for scale. And they produced a very important early model called GPT-2 that achieved another level of scale. And it was impressive. And OpenAI, for their part, felt that they were seeing the future. And in fact, they went public with, hey, we think something very important is happening here. It could really change the world, but it also carries risks. And so for that reason, we are not going to publish the model weights. They hid the model weights. And in the research community, I remember that got ridiculed. No one took them seriously. At Microsoft, mainly through the vision and understanding of Kevin Scott, we took this very seriously. And in fact, started the process of deciding to make our first major investment in OpenAI. And we tried also to help with that messaging. And, in 2019, if you said the word AI, you didn't think of some unknown little startup called OpenAI, and you didn't think of big, boring Microsoft. The first name maybe that would come to your mind would be a name like Google. So no one kind of took us that seriously. And that played out again with GPT-3. A month before GPT-4 was released, Sam Altman wrote a very public, lengthy blog post recommending caution, red teaming, independent audits, wanting regulators to wake up to this. And again, it seemed to have very little or no impact. When GPT-4 was finally released to the world, the hubbub, of course, was very significant. And there was this famous letter that the couple hundred leading intellectuals signed called the pause letter. And it was very annoying to me personally, and I think to others, because it basically was calling for the same things that, say, Sam Altman and team were calling for years. And it didn't seem to acknowledge that at all. But the pause letter did do something very, very important, which is it got leading thinkers around the world to really wake up and start taking this technology very, very seriously. And that's been a good, I think, for the world.
So I think some did in that time frame, but I still definitely had a lot of skepticism. I think, at least for me and many people who started to use it early on, I felt sometimes slow, clunky. The fabrications were deeply problematic. And it really was questionable whether or not it was just programming, a lot of programming to make something like that happen, which really isn't true AI if it's being programmed. And it felt like that because sometimes it was like we were going from two extremes, like something totally fabricated and then something else that, is almost like hallucinogenic in its quality. And that it felt like we were sort of programming to get to an acceptable middle. I think now, as the technology has gotten better, you hear less and less of that. And the part of us that's become very worried about our own future jobs and how do we make careers, how do we make money, all those sorts of voices now, I think you hear much more. But tell us about that transition that you saw from this technology is really just PR and marketing and a bunch of hype through to now where a memo went viral this week, written from the perspective of 2028, that basically questioned knowledge work and the viability of knowledge work even existing in 2028, which is not that far away. This is 2 years away where we're talking about complete societal and economic transformation and upset in a scale that is completely unimaginable.
Yeah, wow. I hardly feel qualified to address that, but I can share some thoughts. Yeah, I think the first thing to say, so that people know where I'm coming from, I think in the long term, I'm super optimistic. That this technology is going to bring incredibly meaningful and broad benefits to humanity. Here's one way that I've tried to explain this to like my own family members. You think about the transistor. So the original patent for the transistor was granted in 1926, a long, long time ago, the field effect transistor. And then it took, a couple of decades before Bardeen, Shockley, and crew at Bell Labs could actually make one that worked. And for that amazing accomplishment, of course, they were awarded the Nobel Prize. The question I ask people is, do you know what the first commercial application of the transistor was? And people generally don't remember, but it happened about 5 years later in the early 50s, and it was a tone generator, to make beeps and burps to do telephone switching. And the second commercial application of the transistor was AM transistor radio. So Lilienfeld, for sure, and probably Bardeen and Shockley, did not have in their minds the idea that the transistor could be used to build a scalable digital computer. It just wasn't a thought process. No one had that imagination. So when you look at what's happening with AI today, my personal belief is that the applications we're developing today, they're valuable, but they are the moral equivalent of tone generators and AM transistor radios. And that the true impact of AI in the future, we can't even imagine. What is the moral equivalent of the scalable digital computer? And that gives me just tons of hope and optimism that amazingly great things are going to happen. Having said that, it's definitely true that it could be a rocky road. There are, as with any technology, there are risks of downstream harms. This is a highly democratized technology. Everyone can get their hands on it, including bad people with bad intentions, on and on. So there is a need to be thoughtful about this. There will be massive displacements possibly in labor markets, especially in all forms of knowledge work. And so all of those things, just as a society and just as human beings, we want to be thoughtful about. But the long-term prognosis, I think, is really
unknown, still unknown. You claim to know it. It's like there's so many futurists out there, but how often do we see the futurists getting it right? It's just there are lots of people making money right now claiming to know it. But
hey everyone, we'll get right back to the conversation after a word from our sponsors.
Today's sponsor is Granola. Granola is the AI notepad for people in back-to-back meetings. That is me. I've been using Granola for about a year now, and honestly, it's one of the tools that has changed the way I work. Granola takes meeting notes for me without any intrusive bots joining pitch meetings, interviews, and other calls. And the notes are just fantastic. To show you how good they are, I'm going to be running Granola during today's podcast and sharing the notes with all of you. Once you try it on a first meeting, it's hard to go without. Head to granola.ai/lifers and use the code LIFERS to try it out for yourself.
So if I try to be practical about this, I'm watching what's happening in software development.
Yeah, let's talk about that because we do know with software, we know a little bit more and we're starting to feel the impacts, especially with AI native companies. So let's talk about the software team and how that's already transformed, and then tell us about other industries.
Yeah, so I had described to you before, let's just take the standard, let's say 25-person software development team. So in that 25-person team, you might have 3 or 4 infrastructure devs. You might have maybe 5 UX devs. Maybe the product that this development team is working on relies on a couple of different APIs. So you maybe have 2 teams of 3 or 4 middleware devs. Each of these dev teams, they're very specialized at what they do, very good at what they do. And then because you have these different teams, you have to coordinate them. And so you might have 3, maybe even 4 middle management product managers that help the coordination of all these things so that the whole thing has a chance to result in the coherent output on schedule and, on budget. That's sort of the traditional shape, roughly speaking, of software development or organizations. What is happening now within Microsoft, but really also any kind of AI native software organization, is there's a shift that is happening where a more modern team might only have one specialized dev. Maybe there's some piece of infrastructure that really requires very specialized knowledge, and you might just have 1 or 2 people like that, and they're now more valuable than ever. And then the rest of the devs have more of a full stack orientation. And maybe you have fewer of them, maybe only 8. And maybe they don't natively have full stack knowledge, but because of the assistance of AI, they can do it all, from infrastructure all the way up to UX. And then because they're all full stack and there's fewer of them, you have less need for that coordination function. So some or all of those PMs disappears.
Talk about the scenario that's already starting to happen. It sounds like all the middle level coordination people are gone. It sounds like amongst the developers, you got roughly a similar number on the team, but a different sort. Instead of the specialists, you have generalists capable of using AI. And would you also say that these developers skew a bit more senior? Or do you see this being the junior developers that are willing to use AI, immediately interested in AI, vibe coding on the weekend? Does it favor them or the more like senior people that have all the specialized knowledge?
That's a good question. Over the hill, old farts like me, we're producing code again because of AI. I thought those days were, for me, over 20 years ago. Our CEO, Satya Nadella, is generating code every day. There's a story that Satya tells about that because 50 years ago, if you go into any big company, there would normally be a big room with rows and rows of typewriters and mostly women behind those typewriters. That's called the typing pool, and they'd be typing memos and letters. And so if you had gone into that company and said, someday in the future, every worker in this company, even the CEO, will be typing his or her own letters and memos, you would have been laughed out of that company. And yet here we are. We are all doing that because the personal computer revolution, basically, in order to really exploit the productivity benefits and quality benefits of PCs, has forced a transition of how enterprises operate. And one of the consequences of the transformation is that we all write our own emails and write our own documents, and we type them, and typing pools are gone. And so for sure, when you think about the ability of technology to empower people, it empowers not only frontline, most junior workers, but all levels, all the way up to the CEO. And so I find that really, really interesting. But I guess I don't know if in the end, in software dev teams, whether there will be a clear pattern towards more junior or more senior devs. But the 2 patterns that I do detect that I find very interesting are one that you mentioned, having more generalists and fewer specialists. And then the second pattern, having fewer human beings involved in coordination. Those two things, I wonder if they are going to play out in other forms of elite knowledge work, in law, in finance, in healthcare, you name it. If it does play out, then there are very important lessons that we might be able to learn from what's happening in software today. Software is sort of the ground zero for the deep transformation. And another way to look at this is technology starts off empowering individuals. So, one individual programmer maybe is 20% more productive, 40% more productive because of AI, 100% more productive, whatever. But it doesn't mean that a whole software development organization is more productive until it really kind of transforms itself more deeply. And that is probably true in all other forms of advanced knowledge work, especially the ones that are highly digital. And so I'm very, very interested and very curious just to see if the patterns we're seeing in software are going to play out in these other domains. And I look most closely at healthcare.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about healthcare, just because I think that some people immediately or have gone to the place where they think physicians will no longer have a job in 10 years, especially with embodied AI, which in theory could take over surgery and so many other advancements. And then you hear from somebody like Bob Wachter, who you and I know well, who has this new book out about medicine and AI. I asked him this very question. He said, I can't hire enough radiologists at UCSF. And that was the first specialty that was supposed to be disrupted by AI. And he also said, by the time it gets to me losing my job, you've certainly lost your job. Peter's lost his job. Every lawyer, every consultant has lost that job because the physician has a lot of liability, a lot of risk. They are in a heavily regulated area. So one could argue they might be the last shoe to drop. But of course, healthcare isn't just physicians. It's also millions of people in this country who work in admin. And you mentioned that this job that is basically coordination could go away. Think of how many people health systems hire to do forms of coordination. So let's talk about, although I know it's hard to take the same what's happening in software and then apply it in other industries because there are obviously differences. But let's play out and imagine what could happen in healthcare based on what we know now.
Yeah. And, just to add to what you were just saying, you wonder whether we need as many subspecialties in medicine as we do now. We have endocrinologists being different than nephrologists, being different than cardiologists, because as a human being, the level of investment in time and money to train beyond a single subspecialty is unreasonable, because human beings cognitively have limitations, financially, time-wise. There are all sorts of limitations in human beings. But in the same way that a software developer can have full stack capabilities, maybe something closer to a general practitioner can have, knowledge and capabilities in areas that would normally be owned by radiologists or endocrinologists or whatever. Whether those things will happen, those are concrete ways of asking the question that I'm wondering about. Will there be, in essence, a shift towards more general practice as opposed to subspecialty practice?
And full stack general practice in a
That's
sense.
right. That's right.
You could imagine primary care on steroids, where it's not just we'll evaluate the basics and then send you off to a specialist. It's maybe the AI becomes the specialist. So we'll get an immediate consult from this AI cardiologist. And already you see groups like ARPA-H thinking that there is a huge opportunity with LLMs in cardiology, massive shortages in most states and parts of the country. So could a human GP become so much more, I hate the word empower, but could they do so much more because of AI, so the patient's not being bounced around the system to get an answer?
Yeah. So I think it's easiest to think about this if we put aside the business mechanics of healthcare, at least in the US, because the business mechanics there are very strong entrenched interests that have a business interest in maintaining things the way they are. But if we just look at the pure technology and try to see what's happening right now, maybe there are kind of three categories of technology integration that are happening at the moment that I think are interesting. One is what you might call frontline clinical encounters. So if you take a recent startup like doctronic.com, you can go and you see a chatbot interface, but the bot that you're talking to is like a replacement for the human being that you might encounter in an urgent care, frontline encounter clinic. And when and if it gets to the point that, let's say, a prescription needs to be written for you, for regulatory reasons, at the moment, they hand off right at that moment to a human doctor who is legally empowered to write that prescription. And of course, they want to push the boundaries, and others like them want to push the boundaries and enable at least prescription refills, if not initial prescriptions, scripts to be written by the AI. But we're not there yet. But that kind of initial encounter kind of thing, we're seeing more and more. I participate on the board of trustees for the Mayo Clinic, and even the Mayo Clinic is starting to pilot very realistic looking avatars of human clinicians to do initial frontline encounters, maybe to gather family history information and the like. And I think that that's something that we're going to see much, much more. And in terms of the regulatory pressure, it gives a way to kind of incrementally expand the scope of what those things are allowed to do. And so there, then I would recast your question. In that thread, how far will regulators and business leaders be able to push that? But the logical endpoint of that gets to the point where 98% of what you need a doctor for is entirely that AI encounter. I can't personally predict whether we get to that point, but there's clear line of sight of a way that this plays out where that happens.
So, if we think about AI is actually having a real shot here in care delivery, which is what we're talking about. It's not just the kind of front office, back office, which to me is so obvious. We can almost move past that because we know that's coming. There's no reason for people to be sitting on front desks doing scheduling. That is coming, right? But now we're talking about AI involved in things that clinicians currently do. And you said the whole industry is kind of set up around essentially kind of the system that we have now, which is extremely broken. And that system has produced cost increases year after year after year to a point where it's completely unsustainable. So firstly, I want to throw out a specific example to you because I know it's one that you and I have talked about. And it's the example of the AI ambient scribing companies that now most physicians have access to in this country, whether it be a Nuance, which Microsoft is involved in, or any number of the startups that have popped up and scaled extremely quickly around this idea of doing documentation on behalf of the clinician. So I'll go out there and say, I'll put my view out there, which is, I think these are fantastic. Most of my physician friends are actually enjoying their jobs now for the first time in a very long time. It's taken away so much grunt work. But then I also spend time with friends who work at various health plans and payers. And what they have been telling me very consistently is costs are going up because of these scribes. AI is not reducing cost and creating efficiencies and taking unnecessary jobs out of the system and all the things that it was supposed to do. It's piling on more cost, not because of fraud, not because of upcoding or any of these bad things, but because physicians are now billing accurately more than they used to when they used to have to do it on their own. And you could argue, again, that that's a good thing, that they should get paid for the care rendered. But the current code sets, we didn't create these codes in a time where we could even conceive of AI. So what it's done is a visit that should have been $100 is now $200 because of all the ways in which the AI is finding more ways to code. And this is all, I realize, a little bit of a long and convoluted example, but I think it's such an important one because it shows AI as having both great and wonderful impacts almost immediately, and then also unnecessary consequences that have done on a systemic level are creating more cost problems to a system that's already bloated and absolutely overburdened. So what is your take on that as a sort of first example of where we've seen AI at scale?
Yeah. So I just love listening to you. It's so insightful. And I have to say, I come out of this with somewhat mixed feelings, incredible pride, what's been accomplished, and also some guilt about what happens. So let me start by saying with the bottom line up front that technology on its own, particularly if you only do drop-in enhancements in the existing system, technology on its own isn't going to fix healthcare. So that's one conclusion that I have, that there needs to be a deeper transformation that could be helped by technology. But if you think about ambient scribing, it is what I would call a drop-in tech enhancement. It doesn't fundamentally change the workflow that much in healthcare delivery. It just drops in and makes one step in the whole process of delivering healthcare better for both patients.
It greases the wheels of the existing system that requires all this documentation in the first place.
So if that's all that technology is for, it's not going to repair the things that are truly broken about the healthcare system. Now, why am I both incredibly proud and then feeling guilty? On the pride, way back in 2016, I was sent into purgatory within Microsoft. The Satya Nadella and the leadership pulled me out of Microsoft research and asked me to think about the health tech business at Microsoft. I thought I was being punished for some reason. But, one of the early projects that we started was a project called Empower MD. Empower MD was this idea of could you have an artificial intelligence that would watch doctors and nurses in action and then try to come up with ways to learn from them and assist them. And the flagship application was to observe a doctor-patient encounter and then set up a clinical note. That was like app number one for Empower MD. We ran into this doctor at UPMC, Dr. Shiv Rao, and he started collaborating with us on this project. He was really great. And then we learned that the folks at Nuance were working on a very similar project. And so we started collaborating with them. So it was a three-way collaboration. At some point, it got serious enough that Shiv decided to spin off a company called The Bridge today. And they have a great product in the space.
Raised more than $1 billion. And
That's right. Yeah.
it's amazing to see the level of scale that several others in the space have.
Oh, yeah. No, it's great. That Shiv is great.
Yeah.
And then with Nuance, we continue to do such great work that that was one factor in Microsoft's decision to acquire Nuance. And we have the leading product in the space called Dragon Copilot. And then last summer, Epic, the big electronic health records company, announced that they would offer ambient scribing as a default feature of their EHR for no additional fee in their EHR. And for us within Microsoft Research, this was a watershed moment. Like it had fully arrived, something that could be available to every clinic, every clinician. So tremendous pride to have been a part, to have contributed a little bit to that happening. So that's great. Now the guilt. During COVID, I had a growth on my cheek here that was concerning. So I went to a dermatologist and luckily determined that it was nothing dangerous at all, but thought that cosmetically it was good to remove it. So had it treated. It was a nice dermatology clinic that had the nurse as a scribe. So I was just curious. 2 days later, I went online to look at the clinical note that was submitted, and it had a notation there that the growth was making it impossible for me to safely wear a COVID mask, which wasn't really true. But when I looked up the code on a fee schedule, it was reimbursed at about 4x higher than it would have normally. So it was an example of upcoding. And so I immediately took that to the Nuance folks within Microsoft said, will drag in Copilot do similar upcoding? And the answer is no, it absolutely would not do that. And I doubt that a Bridge or any of these other systems would. And so that kind of set me back because we're charging a lot of money for these products to providers that don't have money to burn. And at least in this case, it would actually reduce or eliminate revenue opportunities, and maybe correctly so. But it was a complicated thing for me to think about. And then on top of that, this technology has opened up advanced coding for billing purposes to a much wider array of healthcare organizations. And to your point, that has resulted in more cost burden in the aggregate on the healthcare system. And then for those organizations that already were doing advanced coding, it has actually reduced the revenue opportunities. So the whole thing is kind of messy to think about.
It's really about how the AI fits in with the current incentive structures and the system that we have today. The fact there even is a fee schedule is part of the system that we have today. And none of that system was really built around AI. Ruchika Fernandopoulos, who some people think of as the father of value-based care, started a company called Ira Health. And he talks about this all the time, that the system that we have now that is based on these codes was really built at a time where physicians were an extremely scarce resource, that finding care should be expensive and should have certain limitations around the quantity that you can access. And that was where that kind of billing code set came about. And now, to me, the promise is where care doesn't become a scarce resource that's only available to a select few that can afford it. Even those with insurance can barely afford it in the system that we have now, but that it becomes abundant because you have an AI, it could be an agent, could be an LLM, walking you through that, you mentioned growth on your cheek, being available to you at any moment, including in the middle of the night, to assess and diagnose and then treat. And I know that Microsoft has done some studies that I have read and written about looking at the cost piece of this as well, and that AI is actually very effective at determining the next right step, even more so oftentimes than a GP or a specialist, that is actually the cheaper next step versus just sending you to the highest priced option, which is what happens today. So in theory, all of this could be deflationary, but then it's not going to be deflationary if CMS just decides, let's add AI to the fee schedule. If we just, in the same way that we did with ambient scribes, we take this great technology and we force it into the system that we have now, and where you get health systems saying, we've talked about this on this podcast extensively with health system CFOs who say, either we just eat the cost to $10-15 million to get nuance in the hands of every practitioner, or we have to find ways to make them more productive, so see more patients. What we're saying now, more coding. So somewhere the revenue has to come back. It's not going to just be a pure gift. And that's, again, it's like how it fits into the current system versus are we willing to create a net new one that allows AI to do the deflationary things that we so desperately need.
Let me tie this back to what I was saying before, because what you were talking about touches on this about coordination, because coordination is a real drag. Coordination creates scarcity. And here's what I mean by that. So if you think of a healthcare delivery setting, so maybe you go see your GP because you have maybe some pain in your side, and your GP wants to refer you to a specialist. So they write a referral letter. In a typical setting right now, the coordination is on your shoulders, you as the patient. You have the referral letter. You now have to make a phone call, make appointments. It might take several weeks to get that first appointment. That specialist, generally speaking, isn't going to just take at face value the existing medical record and the referral letter. He or she will want to see you first and then decide, oh yeah, this referral makes sense. Let's make another appointment down the line to actually now do that specialized thing. And if that might happen 2 or 3 times, and the whole thing kind of stretches out. Meanwhile, that specialist and your GP have revenue-wise an expectation to process a certain number of cases per day. So that's one approach that's very common in healthcare today. Now, imagine that we can eliminate that coordination effort through AI or through better integration or whatever. So now what can happen is your GP issues that referral, but the AI or maybe the GP, because of having a lower caseload, handles the coordination handoff to the specialist for you. And because it's doctor to doctor or AI to doctor handoff, you only need to see that specialist once and immediately get treated. So the length of your whole journey through that episode maybe is 30% shorter. In that world, every doctor can have a lower daily caseload and yet realize greater revenue because the total throughput of patients over a yearly basis will be higher. And this actually happens in software development as well. Again, making the analogy to that form of knowledge work. And so that is a possible world where patients are happier because their doctor who they trust is handling either through AI or through personal management, the coordination. Your doctor's happier because they can process more patients per year, even if they have a lower daily caseload. So they're less frazzled. And the specialist is happier because their initial encounter with you is not with you, but with the doctor that's handing off. And they might benefit from a lower daily caseload. And so there's a scenario here where everybody wins.
I'm going to push back because there are a lot of people employed in coordination roles in our current system. So the coordinators don't win. And yet I am so bored by the way that we talk about AI in this healthcare industry as just assistance, just empowerment, just business as usual, but with, slightly more assistance in the background and make the job more fun. That is the world that we're comfortable with. And yet, even in the best case scenario that you just painted, there are still people who don't have roles we don't need in the
Right.
Still, the coordination jobs need to go. So let's go there a little bit. Imagine a scenario where it's not all empowerment, right? Like your Empower Physicians initiative. If you're in healthcare today, what jobs do you think we should be most worried about, least worried about, and why?
So in the outpatient setting, I think that these coordination kinds of roles are the kind of administrative roles that handle referrals, billing, a lot of the kind of back office functions, but also forms of what you might call concierge-like services, taking the hint from what we're seeing in software engineering today. I think we will just need fewer and fewer of those things. If things go right with the integration of AI in improving the system and improving patient experiences, we will just need fewer of those. And then on specialists, I think that the impact on the reduction in need for kind of specialized knowledge will first happen on the payer side. Because today you might have specialized adjudicators on the payer side that deal with certain types of outpatient clinics, fee-for-service versus value-based, inpatient services, other kinds of acute versus subacute care services and so on. And each one of those today, oftentimes, especially in the big payers, requires a different set of adjudicators that are highly specialized for each of those. It's hard to understand or see a future where people augmented by AI would be able to have very general purpose coverage of those things. Will that mean that we need fewer of those adjudicators on the payer side? It probably does, but there's value then in the reduction of need of the coordination across all those different adjudicator teams. And that, again, to my mind, we're seeing this play out in software engineering. It just means that the future is not that bright in terms of the number of these kind of coordination roles that we need. And it just seems like this will happen first on that side. Now, on the clinical side, it's tougher because It takes a long time for medical education to evolve. Like there's a endpoint here where maybe 90% of what we need are general practitioners empowered by AI. And that in the remaining 10%, much of that is entirely AI involving no humans. And so in that kind of future, maybe we have a real reduction in the number of medical specialties. It's a big if, because actually when you look at the history of modern medicine, the number of medical specialties that have disappeared is very small. My two favorite examples are phrenology, which doesn't really exist today, and the use of barbers to do bloodlettings as a treatment for things like the flu or whatever. But it's very hard to come up with other examples, actually in any domain of knowledge work, where specialties sort of fade away to nothingness. It's a fairly rare thing. And the more advanced the knowledge work domain is, the more rare that is. And I think the reason for that aren't technological barriers, generally. They are barriers in how our education system and certification systems and all the human systems around things. Like if you think of the accreditation of medical schools, accredited medical school probably always will have to be able to train cardiologists, no matter what, for decades to come. And so yeah, it would take a long time before we would ever come to the conclusion that, oh, we don't need people specially trained in cardiology, if we ever get to that point.
So I want to end on a little bit of a different note, which is something we were talking about earlier today at the conference, and that is the idea of creativity and human creativity in particular. And I feel like that's a lovely note to land us on, because AI, I think, gives this creativity concept that I think is still unique to human beings even more credence. So tell us about your theory of creativity and what it means in an AI future.
Yeah, thanks for taking us here. And also, I just don't want listeners to misunderstand. I mean, the level of amazing capabilities and optimism. Like if I think of Mustafa Suleiman's team, led by Dominic King and Peter Hames and so on, just at Microsoft, their sequential diagnosis model, MAIDXO, its diagnostic capabilities are just off the charts, superhuman. It is incredible what's possible. And, they just point to a potentially really bright future. But to your question, this is a discussion that actually my friend, boss, and colleague, Kevin Scott, and I have quite frequently. And it is the question of to what extent, will AI be truly creative? And easy place to think about this is in the area of mathematics. So right now, if you have a theorem, a mathematical theorem, and you ask an AI system to come up with a proof of that theorem, AI is advancing very rapidly and getting better and better. In fact, it's just on the verge in some domains of mathematics at being better at coming up with a proof of a theorem, better than any living human being. We're just on the verge of seeing that happen. And that is incredible. And, to come up with a proof of a theorem, there are elements that you might call creativity, to have some insight and some way of approaching this. But that's not what I mean by creativity or what Kevin would mean by creativity. What we would mean by creativity is, will AI come up with the next truly interesting, relevant, and beautiful theorem to prove in the first place? If we want to talk about medical research, clinical research, if you have a clinical trial with some defined endpoints, AI is today really good if you give it enough clinical data at coming up with answers as to whether the ultimate conclusion against those endpoints will be positive or negative. Probably better than any human being could do today. But the real creative thing is, can AI come up with the best endpoints in the first place and define those things? And so when we think about creativity, that at least for me, probably for Kevin Scott, that's the big unknown. Will AI get to the point where it has human level or even superhuman creativity to pose the best, next, most interesting, most beautiful, most relevant mathematical theorem to prove? Because AI will get to the point where it can come up with a proof better than any human being.
I believe it on the proof, but then, at least for me personally, every time I go for a run, which is one of my favorite things to do, and I look at the trees and feel the wind blowing and I'm on my run and I have all this empty space. At some point on the run, I'm going to have an idea, some spark. And to me, that is the piece of this that is uniquely human. It's my ability to experience that wind and that sun through the trees and how that changes my brain and just allows me to focus enough where suddenly something will hit me and it's an idea that me in front of a computer screen would never have been able to come up with. And I think for a mathematician, that's the theory, not the proof. And so I feel excited and inspired by the idea that at some point, maybe we are far less attuned to execution and far more so to the thing that we enjoy most, which is the creativity, the imagination, the spark. And then somebody else can go off and pull it off, right? Like, so that the ideas don't just exist in the ether and never really come to fruition. So I love that we actually don't know if that's even possible. And in many ways, I hope it isn't, because at least it reserves something for those of us who come up with our most creative ideas and I would say the most human of the settings. So with that, pizza, we have a lunch here at Lake Nona Impact Forum that I know we're both eager to get to. So really appreciate you coming on Lifers and telling us what's at the frontier of AI, what's coming, and also so many of the stories that you've shared around how it all came to fruition and the seeds of it that you've been seeing on the front lines really for the past 30 years, maybe even longer. So yeah, really appreciate the time. Thank you, Peter.
It was fun. Thanks for having me.
That's a wrap on Lifers. If you know someone else grinding it out in healthcare, send them this episode. And if you want more unfiltered takes on digital health, check out the Second Opinion newsletter, link in the show notes.